Welcome to the Gemsbach. This video is about The Witness, a 2016 game developed by Thekla.
This freedom to doubt is an important matter in the sciences, and I believe in other fields. It was born of a struggle. It was a struggle to be permitted to doubt, to be unsure. And I do not want us to forget the importance of the struggle, and by default, to let the thing fall away.
Game designers who take seriously the idea that they are creating works of potential artistic significance operate at a great risk to their peace of mind. Regardless of the quality of their efforts, if their works are successful, they can expect to be bombarded with accusations that they are over-serious, over-dramatic, pretentious, overly political, egotistical, annoying, and snooty.
The crewmates are empiricism and the barnacles are Neoplatonism. And the captain of that ship was Albert Einstein. What the hell was I talking about?
While players may be mostly united in the proclamation that games can be art, they often behave as though they are allergic to what it would mean for the world to accept that postulate. The production, and later the analysis, of works that are at least as challenging in subject matter as they are in mechanics. One frequent target for that manner of short-sighted criticism is Jonathan Blow, the lead designer and partial programmer of The Witness, which was made with a small team under the developer name Thekla. Blow definitely deserves some of the criticism he receives, but it's his social media accounts, not his games, that demonstrate that. And when it comes to The Witness in particular, he led his team in the production of a great work of art. The Witness is a game in which the player wanders an uninhabited, brightly colored island, slowly uncovering its landscape and details by tracing lines on the faces of circuitry panels installed throughout. On first glance, The Witness is a quasi-conventional title, in which the player solves visual logic puzzles in order to ascend and explore a conspicuously placed mountain. Beyond that first impression, however, it slowly becomes clear that The Witness is a work overflowing with visual trickery, peppered with recordings of fiction and philosophy, offering a coherent yet concealed story concept, and harboring some of the most astonishing secrets hidden in plain sight in any piece of popular media ever made. These latter elements, much like the narrative details of Blow's prior game, Braid, have garnered a fair amount of the heavy-handed dismissal described a moment ago. Presumably, players are so keen to reject this kind of material precisely because it is at present relatively uncommon, unexpected, and thus instinctively unwelcome in games. But this tendency of people to brazenly dismiss ideas which are not straightforward in their delivery does not land only on game designers, and is in fact a long-standing tradition among the public reactions to certain academic fields and artistic styles. A natural case in point is the practice of deconstruction, a movement in, or method of, philosophy and literary theory that was popular across the humanities in the late 20th century. In a very simplified nutshell, as a technique of analysis, deconstruction teases out contradictions and ambiguities in the grammatical, linguistic, and thematic content of a work, in order to demonstrate a general idea about an inability to access a work's singular true meaning, or to access an immutable correspondence between language and reality.
Language is a poor enough means of communication. Besides, there are damn few words that anybody understands.
Interestingly, I personally feel that the reactions of most onlookers are not the only things that deconstruction and Thekla's game have in common. I intend to show here that this analytical application of deconstruction provides a remarkably appropriate path into interpretation of The Witness. The nature of this video is such that it requires spoiling all major plot and gameplay details of The Witness, and this is a game whose best experiences are unusually vulnerable to being ruined by spoilers. You should only continue watching after this section if you either truly do not mind spoilers or have already played the game.
It may reasonably be doubted whether the whole picture can ever be comprehensible to one small and apparently quite insignificant part of the picture.
What exactly happens in the game? The events or circumstances which may possibly be called its plot may not be straightforward even to some individuals who have previously played it. The Witness is remarkably neutral and complacent toward the prospect of players missing large chunks of its content, and that extends even to basic facts about the nature of the game world. In large part, this is because The Witness operates across 3 levels of cognitive awareness about its world, which are each uncovered in turn as one delves deeper into playing it. The first level is the straightforward solving of the panel-based line puzzles to explore the island and advance toward entering the mountain. For many first-time players, and probably even some second-time players, this seems to be the entire thing. Even if they happen upon a few small recorders containing snippets of philosophy or other prose read aloud, a player at this stage is likely to view the game as an essentially aimless, contemplative puzzle game.
Through many births, I have wandered on and on, searching for, but never finding, the builder of this house.
If one continues along that trajectory and makes it all the way through the mountain, they climb into Willy Wonka's great glass elevator and get scooted back to the start of their journey.
Hold on, everybody. Here it comes.
With only the smallest fanfare of an aerial view of the island, as all of their hard work is undone. The puzzles unsolve themselves, the opened doors close, and the lasers pointing at the summit turn off and fold away.
A flash
of lightning in a summer cloud.
A flash of lightning in a summer cloud.
At some point along the path to that ending, however, in the game's most potentially mind-blowing twist, the player is likely to have uncovered the second level of possible awareness. The landscape and architecture of the island themselves contain numerous puzzles, both general visual trickery and specific line-based puzzles like those on the panels. Though the player may find this particularly neat for a while, it and stumbling across more of the recordings are still unlikely to lead to them piecing together the story of the game, except in the vaguest of terms. But upon returning to a save prior to the aerial ending, further exploration can bear fruit. Having every available laser operational allows activation of a set of panels which grant access to a cave system below the mountain. There, two crucial discoveries can be made which finally reveal what's going on. The first such discovery that can be made is that the set of recorders there seldom contain solitary quotations like those elsewhere, and are instead, at least in part, dialogues.
It's good. It's already good.
Thanks. But we've kind of picked high goalposts. Every little bit matters.
These recordings are revealingly occupied with meta-level discussions of the design and testing of the island itself.
On that island, we are going to be in very susceptible states. So, be careful with it.
Especially as it pertains to crafting the set of thought-provoking quotes which can be found there.
These are objects of contemplation. These are about focus and clarity. We agreed at the outset.
Yeah, I know. And I don't want to change any of that.
They strongly imply that the island is a virtual world into which people will somehow be placed, indefinitely suspended in what amounts to an induced dream, and from which such people will have to willingly choose to exit and awaken upon gaining sufficient understanding to do so.
So, how did it go?
I don't know. I don't remember.
Wait, what?
No, it's normal for me. I never remember my dreams.
Do you remember everything else about your life?
It's fine. I mean, we're just doing suppression, not lobotomies.
Why did we let you go first?
First hasn't happened yet. I was just dipping my toes into the pool. Real first happens when someone dives right in and gets to decide for themselves when to come out.
The second crucial discovery that lies beneath the mountain is a panel map with a familiar shape. Correctly following its instructions recloses the door to the garden at the start of the game, allowing the now enlightened player the opportunity to notice the only world-based puzzle that bars content, a line puzzle between earth and sky that opens a door through the air itself. Through the opening, one briefly explores a seemingly fourth wall-breaking resort area containing credits for the game's development staff, before wandering down a dark hallway and discovering a definitive presentation of the third and final layer of game world awareness. That the experiences on the island truly were an extended VR-like journey for a human being lying on a couch in Thekla's own development studio.
Did you feel this way before your trip to the island, or after?
Well, I think after.
Your attitude to the piece changed, or clarified, I guess, maybe based on the trip. Hey, that means it's working. I mean, something's working, right? Maybe.
In retrospect, another curious discovery can be acknowledged as a hint at the situation of the game within a real-world setting exterior to the island. A subterranean projector room containing unlockable clips of mostly live-action video footage.
The details of real experience are very far often from the fundamental laws.
Needless to say, this sequence of revelations has prompted various interpretations, but many such interpretations have coalesced around a singular notion: that the witness both is and represents an attempt by Thekla to develop and utilize a virtual world to provide its users with a deep awareness of their own consciousness. Now, I think that explanation of the game, as being basically an act of meditation, is a solid interpretation. But it is not the only possible interpretation of the game, and before we're done here, I intend to provide you with at least 2 alternatives.
Acts of perception attach themselves only to veils, which leave traces in the owner of the eye that perceives them.
In order to understand the twists and turns I will now take you through, it is necessary for you to have at least a vague understanding of deconstruction. It's renowned as a difficult topic, but it genuinely doesn't need to be. Much of its purported difficulty and convolution comes from the fact that several of its most famous proponents and developers were attempting to incorporate the ideas underlying the movement into their actual ways of writing. I do respect them for that consistency, and don't even mind reading that stuff myself. But that approach does make them extremely bad at explaining their ideas to newcomers.
It is established what many deny, that man in posse of Testu and Cunard, that man in Essie, that man in short, that man in brief, in spite of the strides of alimentation and defecation, is seen to waste and pine.
But here's 2 bits of good news. First, that's not my style, and second, we don't need an understanding of every philosophical facet of the movement to get going here, just how deconstruction is used in a practical sense in literary theory. So, put simply, when someone deconstructs a text, they illustrate how certain aspects of that text provide valid justification for multiple mutually exclusive interpretations. Or, another way of putting it could be, in deconstruction, someone highlights the existence of deep interpretive ambiguities. That's really it. But it's a more grand maneuver than how it may sound, because by doing this, the analyst intends to make it clear that those kinds of complications exist in every text, in every speech act, in every language, and thus infect, at the very least, all art, or potentially all attempts at speaking truth and communicating about reality. Now, to drive this general idea of deconstruction home, we can take advantage of the fact that not every notable writer working with deconstruction is as incomprehensible to the uninitiated as the folks referenced a moment ago. Along those lines, here is a simple analysis of a rhetorical question drawn from the television program All in the Family, written by one of the preeminent first-wave post-structural literary theorists, Paul de Man. Asked by his wife whether he wants to have his bowling shoes laced over or laced under, Archie Bunker answers with a question: what's the difference? Being a reader of sublime simplicity, his wife replies by patiently explaining the difference between lacing over and lacing under, whatever this may be, but provokes only ire. What's the difference did not ask for difference, but means instead, I don't give a damn what the difference is. The same grammatical pattern engenders 2 meanings that are mutually exclusive. The literal meaning asks for the concept, difference, whose existence is denied by the figurative meaning. As long as we are talking about bowling shoes, the consequences are relatively trivial. But suppose that it is a debunker rather than a bunker, and a debunker of the archy, or origin. An Archie debunker, such as Nietzsche or Jacques Derrida, for instance, who asks the question, what is the difference? And we cannot even tell from his grammar whether he really wants to know what difference is, or is just telling us that we shouldn't even try to find out. Confronted with the question of the difference between grammar and rhetoric, grammar allows us to ask the question, but the sentence by means of which we ask it may deny the very possibility of asking. For what is the use of asking, I ask, when we cannot even authoritatively decide whether a question asks or doesn't ask? Is it enough for the purpose of deconstruction to showcase contradictions that are present in a work? No, not at all. For a successful deconstruction, it is necessary to demonstrate how singular details within a work can be read in multiple viable, contradicting, or at least divergent ways. These contradictions may arise between grammar and rhetoric, between syntax and substance, between text and subtext, between metaphor and metonymy. They may even simply arise among different literal translations possible according to the various definitions of particular words.
How soon can you land?
I can't tell.
You can tell me I'm a doctor.
No, I mean, I'm just not sure.
Or can't you take a guess?
Well, not for another 2 hours.
You can't take a guess for another 2 hours?
Okay, so what does any of this have to do with The Witness? Am I saying that The Witness is some kind of obviously self-contradicting work that self-destructs at the slightest critical touch? No, I'm not. Remember, one of the key insights of deconstruction is that every work is vulnerable to its frightful jaws. And as I mentioned at the end of the previous section, there is already a prevailing narrative about the meaning of The Witness in secondary writing about it, which is that the work is primarily about ego death, meditation, and awareness. Yet that interpretation, however convincing, differs considerably from my own intuited interpretation of the work, in which it is principally about meaning, science, and philosophy. What I intend to show hereafter is not merely a contradiction. There is both important overlap and important contradiction between these readings. After much consideration, I have come to feel that both of these analyses together sum into a deconstructive reading that is at least as compelling as either of them.
In a sense, what modern physics is to the history of Western thought, Zen is to the development of the Eastern worldview. Yet the difference between the two could hardly be more marked.
While it differs widely from the conception of the game that I formed upon playing it, the reading of The Witness as a meditation on meditation is a compelling, consistent, and thorough one. It spares almost no game details, and it has by now been eloquently expressed by multiple individuals. I will now cover that perspective in brief, as I understand it. Especially through its far-flung audio logs and projector room film clips, The Witness contains a broad array of viewpoints on the seeking of truth and meaning. While many of these are in quibbling contradiction with each other, coming at the topic from scientific, philosophical, religious, and more perspectives, a substantial proportion of them comment on the act of seeking truth and meaning at an elevated, meta level.
This I thing is what ultimately seems to each of us to constitute the most solid rock of undeniability of all. Could it possibly be an illusion? Or if not a total illusion, could it possibly be less real and less solid than we think it is?
This latter notable grouping of perspectives deals especially with concepts in Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, meditation, and mindfulness.
Ask yourself, can I, this presence of awareness, ever lack something? Thoughts can say that something is missing. Feelings can say that something is missing. But what about you?
This angle on the game was most persuasively and artfully expressed in a video created by Joel Goodwin of Electron Dance, who says, "The Witness is a meditation on truth-seeking, thus has no answers. It is deliberately paradoxical, in keeping with Zen tradition. If The Witness were a verse in the Diamond Sutra, it would probably go something like this. The pursuit of truth is not the pursuit of truth. Therefore, we must pursue the truth." In service of this emphasis on becoming aware of awareness and conscious of consciousness at the highest, most neutral, most meta echelon, a state which Goodwin has notably pointed out to be called witness consciousness in certain intellectual traditions, The Witness consistently enforces a slow and considered way of playing. Except for the timed challenge, The Witness celebrates pause and reflection. Every machine on the island moves slowly. The shutters, the lasers, the lifts. As a game, a commitment to contemplation has been chiseled deep into its design. The quiet, overworld vistas of the island are traversed without any background music whatsoever. The audio logs are spaced out widely and can be considered individually, in isolation from each other. The physical machinery on the island operates at a noticeably slower pace than would be needed for simple traversal and access. Many of the island's visual and environmental puzzles can be solved simply through careful observation of the surroundings, rather than logical problem solving. And none of the panels lock you into solving them, such that one can wander freely and contemplate all available paths of progress. Such elements provide both enough time for, and numerous rewards for, careful contemplation, as if to foreground contemplation as the most fundamental element of the witness, above and beyond any specific kernel of meaning available in any specific audio log, puzzle solution, or film clip.
The method in the Rinzai school is to put the intellect to work on problems that have no logical resolution. Such problems are known as koans, and their common aim is to induce a kind of intellectual catastrophe.
And in The Witness's most devious apparent bait and switch, the highest difficulty segment of the game, in which the player must solve a long sequence of randomized panels against the game's only noteworthy time constraint in order to access a conspicuously placed film clip reward, grants access to an hour-long lecture by game designer Brian Moriarty about how great works of art do not hide things away, but rather overflow with generous value, and about how seeking answers and patterns too fervently can lead to insanity.
Ordinary games, with their contrived Easter eggs and cheat codes, are like the Battery of the Month Club. You have to trudge down to the back of the store to get what you really came for. Awesome things don't hold anything back. Awesome things are rich and generous. The treasure is right there.
The reading of the game's final ending cutscene, then, becomes one that reveals the purpose of the island retroactively, as a virtual world created for the express purpose of allowing its users to access witness consciousness. Thus, the island is an object not unlike a Zen koan, created with the lofty goal of abstracting a person away from specific logical consideration of the world and toward non-rational direct experience.
Of all the communities available to us, there's not one I would want to devote myself to, except for the Society of True Searchers, which has very few living members at any time.
As the conception of the witness as a meditative act is cohesive and thorough, in theory we can all just pack up and go home now. It's solved. Except, obviously, as much as I am impressed by the excellence and depth of the readings that result in that conclusion, I don't think that captures everything that the witness has to say. In order to express why I hold that opinion, I will now present a competing analysis of the witness, not as an act of meditation, but as an act of analysis. The most fundamental unit of gameplay in The Witness is solving an individual line puzzle. The vast majority of one's time with the game, indeed nearly all of one's time with the game, will be spent in active effort to find workable solutions to singular puzzles, each involving the tracing of a line from a circle to an end cap. Tracing from a circle to an end cap is the most basic rule that must be learned and practiced in order to access the content on the island, and additional rules are added from there to groups of line puzzles in specific sections of the game world. If the game is about stepping back from logic and denying the individual truth-seeking ego, then it is very curious that such an overwhelming quantity of one's time with it will be spent in the minutiae of solving logic puzzles. Rather, The Witness may be read not as a game about intentional detachment from specific paths toward meaning and truth, but instead as a game about the act of uncovering meaningful truths, as one does when practicing science or philosophy. Consider the experience of any given section of the island. One approaches a region covered in unpowered panels, and eventually manages to solve a simple puzzle which supplies power to at least one additional puzzle. By building a more thorough understanding of the rules governing puzzle solutions in that region, which almost always mount in complexity in a linear fashion, one can navigate from panel to panel and eventually power on all, or nearly all, of the panels in that region, as marked by the presentation of a laser pointing to the top of the island's mountain. One can master each of 11 such regions, and thereby learn rules of puzzle solving which, in combination with each other, will allow a player to solve all such puzzles across and beneath the island. Learning the underlying logic of a panel in one region is something akin to approaching a new concept in the world from a scientific or philosophical point of view. One can turn a basic understanding of the concept into a complex understanding through further effort and attention, and success at doing so grants access to more difficult and nuanced variations on the concept. In reality, this is a metaphorical or mental access, but in The Witness, it is a literal access. Apart from this embodiment of meaning and analysis in the basic gameplay loop, the game also seems consciously built around the epiphany of realizing that the world includes environmental line puzzles. The best evidence for this is that the summit toward which each of those laser boxes point contains the most conspicuous hint toward that aspect of the world, an otherwise useless panel which mirrors the shape of the river below. While this epiphany could be read as an analogy for enlightenment, a realization that the world is somehow different than it had initially seemed, this epiphany can also be read as an enmeshing of the technical, or one could even say academic, puzzle solving on the panels with the operation of the world at large. In our reality, the practice of specific scientific, mathematical, philosophical, and logical investigation often seems to the superficial observer to be a fatuous exercise in navel-gazing or obsession, an overly enthusiastic approach to topics that are abstruse, impractical, and outside the realm of everyday lived experience.
Only those who realize the immense efforts and, above all, the devotion without which pioneer work in theoretical science cannot be achieved are able to grasp the strength of the emotion out of which alone such work, remote as it is from the immediate realities of life, can issue.
But in actuality, almost every such investigation by every such scientist and philosopher has always been, as Richard Feynman says in one of his video clips in the game, a straightforward and unpretentious effort to understand the world.
The way I think of what we're doing is we're exploring, we're trying to find out as much as we can about the world. People say to me, are you looking for the ultimate laws of physics? No, I'm not. I'm just looking to find out more about the world.
And much in the way that the environmental line puzzles suddenly seem to be everywhere on the island once initially noticed, so a deep understanding of physics or epistemology or ontology will increasingly seem to be relevant to every part of reality once obtained. Brian Moriarty, after all, is not arguing in The Secret of Psalm 46 that there are no hidden meanings in reality or in works of art, merely that meaningful work has a chance to inspire the passionate emotion of awe, that hiding away the most interesting parts of a work is not necessarily the best idea, and that analysts not sufficiently considering opposing viewpoints may chase their awe at apparent patterns into madness.
Did you know that there's a direct correlation between the decline of spirograph and the rise in gang activity? Think about it.
I will.
No, you won't.
Thus, the contradictory material in the game's audio and video logs would come across not as a general communication of the futility of truth-seeking enterprises, but rather as an indictment of any approach to truth-seeking which lacks humility and breadth.
If a man, holding a belief which he was taught in childhood or persuaded of afterwards, keeps down and pushes away any doubts which arise about it in his mind, purposely avoids the reading of books and the company of men that call into question or discuss it, and regards as impious those questions which cannot easily be asked without disturbing it, the life of that man is one long sin against mankind.
It is a game so thorough in its metaphor of investigating reality by looking at things from different points of view, that in it you are constantly tasked with physically looking at its world from different points of view. The meditative reading of The Witness prizes the slow pace of movement and mechanical functioning on the island. Yet all analyses of the game as meditative which I have seen largely ignore the many forms of haste and convenience granted to the player. The ability to run, the instant access to each subsequently unlocked puzzle within an area, the boat for fast transportation that features 4 available speeds, the network of caves ultimately providing quick movement between the lower areas of the mountain and the rest of the map, the ability to skip a few entire sections of the island and still access the mountain, the lake and obelisks pointing out where a player has unsolved or unfound content on the island, the ability to fast forward and rewind the videos in the projection room, and, of course, the fact that the game's most revealing ending is reachable in a matter of minutes after starting a new game once it has been found. Even the scant few elements that do stand out to me as excessively slow, like the set of moving walkways in the swamp, basically always serve some purpose. In the case of those walkways, the sluggish operation aids in the discovery and completion of several subtle environmental puzzles. The game is not some kind of sadistic exercise in purposefully wasting the time of its players. In fact, while it may operate in some small ways at a slower and more considered pace than is typical of the medium, it also keeps the player actively engaged in gameplay to a rare degree throughout the dozens of hours of experiencing it. Few are the games, including notables like Myst and Dark Souls and Shadow of the Colossus and Breath of the Wild, which largely set their players free into nearly cutsceneless expanses of pure interactivity. Moreover, the meditative reading tends to privilege the audio logs and videos pertaining to meditation and awareness, while discarding, or painting only as dissenting opinions, the audio logs and videos pertaining to philosophy and science.
The sincerity of his conviction can in no wise help him, because he had no right to believe on such evidence as was before him. He had acquired his belief not by honestly earning it in patient investigation, but by stifling his doubts.
The cacophony of voices is nearly united, however, in their efforts to access truth. They have merely reached differing conclusions.
A good start would be to recognize within yourself the ability to understand anything, because that ability's there.
And one of the "in the studio" dialogue clips speaks approvingly of anyone who can be deemed a truth seeker.
But Portarak was definitely a truth seeker, in the domain of physics at least.
Yeah, but I don't feel that attitude in this piece at all.
Finally, one can read in the ending cutscene not the worthlessness of the knowledge gained in the game world, but rather the insufficiency of reality to feature the specific, simple embodied meaning of the game world. The island in The Witness is a microcosm of an explorable reality, but its simplicity and straightforwardness are artificial, paling in comparison to the true manifold complexity of the real world, where concepts do not inhere in consciously designed line puzzles. In order to incorporate the knowledge gleaned in the game into reality, one will have to apply the strategies one has used to navigate the island in a more nuanced manner, by mapping the metaphor onto mental practices, and not simply by tapping on circles. The player is still the titular witness in this reading, but it is another sense of the word witness which is invoked, one who has seen, and can report, the truth of a matter.
At one extreme is the idea of an objective world, pursuing its regular course in space and time independently of any kind of observing subject. This has been the guiding image of modern science. At the other extreme is the idea of a subject, mystically experiencing the unity of the world and no longer confronted by an object or by any objective world. This has been the guiding image of Asian mysticism. Our thinking moves somewhere in the middle, between these two limiting conceptions. We should maintain the tension resulting from these two opposites.
The puzzles are an expression of discoverable reality. The puzzles are a context for understanding reality as being beyond discovery. The island is a virtual place where one can add to what they have learned about the world. The island is a virtual place where one can unlearn what they have learned about the world. The patterns one can discern in the game world are intentionally meaningful. The patterns one can discern in the game world are intentionally meaningless. What's going on here exactly?
What's the matter, Pop? I'm confused.
As demonstrated in this video thus far, The Witness is a work that is ripe for deconstruction. Not only does it advance multiple, viable, contradictory thematic trajectories, it advances them by way of clips from multiple, viable, contradictory intellectual traditions. The ordering of the video clips in the projector room is seemingly no accident. It spans from a total subordination of art and philosophy to science in Burke's clip at the far left, over to a total subordination of reason to inner peace in Gangaji's clip at the far right, with artistic work by Tarkovsky and eclectic analysis by Moriarty spanning the middle, linked to the ends by the more moderate versions of each extreme represented by Feynman and Spira. This array of viewpoints manifests the spectrum of thought described in the audio logs by Heisenberg and Darling, or the system of interconnecting hierarchies described in the first of the two video clips by Feynman.
The connections of the hierarchies is to connect beauty to history, is to connect history to man's psychology, the man's psychology to the working of the brain to the neural impulse to the chemistry, and so forth, up and down, both ways. And today we cannot, and there's no use making believe we can, draw carefully a line all the way from one end of this thing to the other.
In other words, part of the witness's basic means of communication, regardless of whether one reads the game as self-actualizing meditation or as methodical analytical training, is contradiction itself. It speaks the language of contradiction, of paradox, and, yes, of Zen koan. So what does this deconstruction of the witness say, then? It says that the witness cannot tell you the truth about reality. Hell, the witness cannot really tell you the truth about the witness. Is the witness about the impossibility of knowledge, or is it about the possibility of knowledge? Yes, it is. The witness is about the world itself as ambiguously truth-apt, a place that seems intricately constructed and knowable, yet full of dead ends, contradictions, ambiguities, and clues that point nowhere. The many voices present in the witness are voices present in the real world too, many of them expressed as part of a culmination of someone's life's work, whose words advance propositions they deem to be true and important.
It is cosmic religious feeling that gives a man such strength. A contemporary has said, not unjustly, that in this materialistic age of ours, the serious scientific workers are the only profoundly religious people.
Some of them say the only true religion is scientific enterprise. Some of them say the only true science is religious or spiritual investigation. Some of them say not to seek truth at all.
So it is with man. If he could only roam empty through life, who would be able to injure him?
They step on each other's toes, fly in the face of conventional wisdom, bolster each other, fling mud at each other, and just generally fill out a babbling crowd scene wherein specific meanings can only be found by excluding some of the available evidence.
I can't, for the life of me, see how the postulate of an almighty God helps us in any
you,
way.
who are the
What I
food
do
of the
see
mature,
is that
have
this
given me
ourselves
courage
to
to
such
do
an
violence to
productive
myself.
question
We join
Eternal
as to
forces
why
together
God
to
allows so much
but it is
misery
the
and
center
injustice.
whole.
The island itself operates likewise, presenting numerous paths towards straightforward logical knowledge, the acquisition of which rewards the player, if in no other way at least, with access to additional paths. Yet solving the most obvious sequence of progression merely unsolves itself. Nearly all of the environmental puzzles, both line-based and non-line-based, affect nothing, or only affect their own completion markers. And the arbitrary nature of the included panel puzzles is brought into sharp focus by the section of the timed challenge preceding the maze, which presents a set of 6 randomly generated puzzles, with 4 of them always being generated unsolvable. Now consider the following characteristically obtuse remarks by Jonathan Blow. In a sense, the puzzles are, like Braid, they're not trying to make you be smart. Some of them are harder, some of them are easier, but they're about communicating. They're about exploring some process of form, going through iterations, and you as a player seeing the interesting things that can happen there. So that's one of the many levels at which the game sort of has a mode of encouraging a witnessing presence, to the extent that a game can do that kind of thing. It's a game about looking at things, and seeing them, and knowing that you're looking at things and seeing them. So it tries to add a level of self-referentiality to that process of seeing things, and of asking the question, what is it like to be in a world and walk around and be seeing things, and be hearing things? The witness may be able to get you to think about perception, or about reason or communication. It is not necessarily about the impossibility of finding truth, but it is necessarily incapable of speaking unambiguous truth itself.
The way Zen uses language is always to point beyond language, beyond concepts to the concrete.
Contained within the act of communication is ambiguity, and in ambiguity lives the speech act's deconstruction. So where is truth? If it is anywhere, it is not on the island. One of the fourth wall-breaking bits of dialogue in the game basically says this outright.
These recordings are part of an endeavor built by human beings. And they aspire to truth with a capital T, but we also have to remember that they cannot actually get there.
Nor are the included viewpoints, though they speak at various cross-purposes, in any sense exhaustive. The biases of the island's creators are on full display, as, other than a few artists, they have restricted their pool of possible candidates for quotations to 2 primary groups. People who are developers or popularizers of religion and mysticism, and people who are developers or popularizers of science and mathematics. In a contradiction of Feynman's defense of those working in the middle in his first video clip in the game, all other writers and philosophers have been excluded, despite the discussion of how difficult that choice has made it to find mature representation for certain metaphysical perspectives.
When people are explicitly pushing materialism, they're usually philosophers or writers, not physicists, not people who actually do the frontline work of understanding the physical world.
The only notable philosopher of the past 500 years to make it into the roster is the relatively minor figure of William Kingdon Clifford, presumably having snuck into the lineup under the cover of his work as a mathematician. While the team wouldn't have had to hunt so hard for snippets of serious philosophy in the writing of scientists and gurus, if they had included any other noteworthy philosophers from after the year 1500, instead, the perspective of the island's creators offers the final specific point of view that completes the aforementioned babbling crowd.
Where he says the thing about natural processes, he starts to outline an actual philosophy.
Interesting. There's something that could stand on its own, that isn't just rejection and opposition, but then he drops it.
One can abstract truths from the witness, and there are at least 2 such attempts presented in this video. But if truth is anywhere, it would have to be out in the world, where all of the witness's concepts and attempts at finding truth smash into perceived reality, where one can share their abstractions and critical analyses of art for others to consider in their own existential positions, and where one may actually be able to witness something, whatever it may be. After all, upon reaching the end of the game, regardless of which ending one gets, the game abruptly shuts itself down, kicking the player out by autonomously quitting to desktop.
And a dream.
And a dream.
And a dream.
Suppose that we are offered an alleged joke. We subject it to scientific analysis as we would a chemical salt of doubtful nature, and perhaps after careful consideration, we are able to confirm that it really and truly is a joke. Logically, I suppose, our next procedure would be to laugh. But it may certainly be predicted that as the result of this scrutiny, we shall have lost all inclination we ever had to laugh at it.
If there is one really important criticism of deconstruction as an approach to analysis, it is not any of the conventional ones. That it is unintuitive, that it is pretentious, that it is political. Deconstruction is all of those things, mind you, but I don't personally class any of them as flaws which undermine the movement. Even its purported incoherence is in actuality a detail that its proponents accept and constantly discuss. Rather, if there is one really damning criticism of deconstructive interpretations, it is that they are all very similar. They all intend to showcase the same thing, namely, that works operate through and as a language which is not reducible to truth. Paul de Man, for instance, argued that point through passages from dozens of literary works across several of his own books, in, at least, a feat of impressive rephrasing. As Rick Roderick puts it, speaking, I should point out, in favor of deconstruction, the history of philosophy has not yet presented us with final wisdom, total coverage, and ultimate truth. Deconstructive readings try to work this out in detail, case by case. You know, different attempts to answer it, and how they fail to answer it. See, philosophy is not like building a house, where you start with a firm foundation and build it up, and you're finished, and you walk off, and that's philosophy. Philosophy, under the heading of deconstruction, is housework, which means every day the floor has to be swept again, the dishes have to be done again, and I'll be damned, the next day it's just like that again, and it's just like that again, and it's just like that again. Now, if you want to know why I still think deconstruction is a great movement despite this repetition, that's because I disagree more with its application than with its philosophy. The deconstructive teardown of the confident structuralism it followed was and is appropriate and required. Anyone who says with absolute certainty that works of art are immutable communications of specific meanings that can be found, mapped, and demonstrated is setting themselves up for a rude awakening when they stumble across an equally valid analysis of one of their target texts with an entirely conflicting point of view. To paraphrase J. Hillis Miller, artistic works dismantle themselves on close inspection. But to carry on analyzing works in deconstruction by reenacting that same teardown is to trap oneself in a tedious and infinite critical repetition. Sure, language is a complex set of appearances whose correspondences are fluid and maybe even, ultimately, undecidable. But you really only have to hear that every once in a while to remember it. To put things back in Roderick's terms, I don't think we need to sweep the house every single day. The way to proceed in a post-structural analytical landscape without falling into the trap of making more or less the same analysis of every work is to proceed much the same way that one proceeded in a structural and even pre-structural formalist analytical landscape, but with an abiding sense of humility and irony. While their meanings are ambiguous and arbitrary, and their truths are all arguably false, works of art can nevertheless be shown to be spinning like elliptical galaxies composed of material from specific concepts and topics. Thus, the interpretive work that can still be done in post-structuralism is not to seek for the definite center, where nothing can be found but a black hole, but to forge interpretations by cataloging the materials of the galaxy into useful collections, or abstractions, as I called them in the previous section. These collections can foster thought and creativity, advance or challenge philosophies, further the subjectification of divergent groups, and so on. But all of that still leaves one unanswered question. The reading of the witness in this video is a fairly standard deconstructive interpretation. It showcases how any specific meaning the work might impart is opposed by other meanings that can be drawn out of the same details. The foregoing analysis does not divert from conventional deconstruction in the way described just now. So the question is, why not? Well, you may have noticed a curious fact about this analysis, which was the actual original inspiration for its writing. The implications of the full deconstructive reading overlap with those of the two specific formalist readings of the work as meditation or analysis. This is not an occasion on which one is deconstructing a novel about romance, or a work of philosophy about ethics, in service of showing that the search for truth and meaning is convoluted, enduring, and ambiguously possible. Instead, this is an occasion on which I am deconstructing a work about the convolution, persistence, and possibility of seeking truth and meaning, in service of showing that the search for truth and meaning is convoluted, enduring, and ambiguously possible. You may take whichever of the three interpretations offered here that you happen to prefer, any or all, and remain on just about equally strong analytical footing. To a noteworthy extent, The Witness is a work that can be construed as embracing that complexity.
I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. I have approximate answers and possible beliefs and different degrees of certainty about different things, but I'm not absolutely sure of anything. And then many things I don't know anything about, such as whether it means anything to ask, why we're here, and what the question might mean. I might think about it a little bit. If I can't figure it out, then I go to something else. But I don't have to know an answer. I don't feel frightened by not knowing things.